Welcome to the Classical Gabfest. Normally, this podcast is a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music, but this week we've got something a bit different. I'm your host, William White, but my co-hosts, Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe, are not with me this week, so allow me to explain. We were all set to do a big Live from Montreux episode this summer, where Tiffany and Kensho and I would tape an episode of the podcast on stage with an audience in Hancock, Maine, home of the Pierre Monteux School, which is the institution that binds us all together. In fact, this would have been the first time that the three of us were ever all in the same place at the same time. Alas, I was making my way up the eastern seaboard to Maine, and during a stop in New York, I turned up positive for the novel coronavirus, so I had to stay there and quarantine for 5 days. Unfortunately, that meant that we had to scrap our plans for the big live show. So instead, today's episode is going to be a redux of one of our favorite French-themed segments in honor of Bastille Day, aka le 14 juillet, aka la fête nationale. We'll be hearing what is probably my all-time favorite interview that we've done on the show from episode 26 on February 22nd, 2021. A discussion with the scholar Sally McKee about the American expatriate composer EDMOND DEDE. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment, and for this, we're going to go even further back into the archive with a round of two truths and a lie from our second ever episode, which originally aired on September 8th, 2020.
So we played Game of Pairs last week, and we have a new game for you this week called Two Truths and a Lie. Okay, here's how this works. I have chosen 3 musical excerpts, all ostensibly by the same composer, but in a rather sinister ploy, I have in fact chosen one excerpt that is not by the composer at all. My lovely co-hosts will listen to these 3 excerpts and try to discern which gives lie to the following statement. This week's excerpts are all by Claude Debussy. But before we get to the excerpts at hand, let's discuss what makes Debussy sound like Debussy. What do you guys think?
Well, I personally love that you chose Debussy this week because just earlier this summer, I read a great biography of Claude Debussy called Claude Debussy, Painter in Sound. And to me, that gets to a lot of what makes Debussy sound like Debussy. He's a very poetic composer. He's a composer who can write amorphous sounding music that usually has some kind of a concept behind it, either poetic or visual. He's known as an impressionist composer, but he sort of eschewed that moniker. So I'm listening for ethereal harmonies. I'm listening for music that's hard to exactly put your finger on.
Anything that Debussy writes for me has is suffused in this feeling of light. He was very interested in trying to portray light in music, the feeling of light. And it's really all about the way the surroundings of it feel. So for me, you're often going to have a hard time identifying concrete melodies, things that you would walk away whistling to yourself. You're not going to find a ton of those in Debussy, although he does come up with a few here or there, but they're fleeting. You come upon them, you wonder at their beauty for a while, and then they disappear. So that's sort of what I think when I hear of the sound world of Debussy.
So let's get to the first excerpt. And here is excerpt number 2. And here's excerpt number 3. All right, so here are the 3 excerpts, all of them presumably by Debussy. Tiffany, first thoughts?
This is hard.
Ha
That's
ha
my,
ha ha ha.
that's
Kencho
my
is devious. We've known this
Yeah.
about him.
I'm almost positive that I'm going to go with my guess of in terms of who is not by Debussy, which one is not by Debussy. It's going to be either 1 or 3 because I'm pretty sure number 2, like that's right in there with everything that I know about Debussy from the whole tone scale and then the movement of the key areas that happens about maybe I think 10 seconds into the excerpt. And the last one is quite virtuosic, right, compared to the other 2. I have this feeling of like maybe that's Ravel because that has to me the kind of the sparkliness that a lot of Ravel's piano music has. That's not to say that Debussy didn't write really virtuosic keyboard material, but in terms of the repetition, the ostinato that's happening, that all reads to me a little bit more like Ravel potentially. So those are my initial thoughts. I'm still a little bit unsure as to whether I'll go with my guess of number 1 or number 3. What about you, Will?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Ravel because that would be the obvious dupe in here.
Right, the red herring.
Yes, because Debussy was very influential on Ravel, who was about a half generation younger, and their styles shared many similarities. I mean, Debussy became a very influential composer on French music in general. My guess is actually number 2. Number 2 had a very Spanish style to it. And that is something that, though Debussy was interested in Spanish music, I think Ravel was more interested in Spanish music. So when I hear that little glimmer of Spanish-sounding music, that sort of clues me in. Number 3 had a little childlike melody. And that is very Debussy to me, short little melody fragments that work that way. So I'm pretty sure that number 3 is Debussy. And number 1 is a piece that I recognize. So I'm going with number 2.
Well, I suppose that leaves me with either no choice but to completely go with what Will is saying or to pick my original instinct of number 3. So I suppose I'll go with number 3.
Very interesting. Actually, I love hearing you guys reason it out a little bit. Obviously I picked something, especially the difference between 2 and 3 are very, very similar. So without further ado, let me reveal the lie. The lie was number 2. Now,
Yes!
Considering number 2, Will, who would you guess wrote number 2?
I would guess Ravel, but I would think that there are other possibilities who might include De Falla.
Albeniz, possibly?
Albeniz, yeah.
So it wouldn't surprise you if it were another French composer or a Spanish composer.
That would be my guess.
Speaking.
I mean, if the Impressionist movement had a home, musically speaking, it was France, and then with a very specific kind of flair, Spain.
So would it surprise you if I said that the composer of number 2 is in fact American?
Oh.
Wow.
This piece is from Charles Griffiths.
Oh,
3
nice.
tone pictures, and this is the 3rd movement, The Night Winds.
Wow, no, that I never would have guessed.
That's awesome.
So yes, apologies for quite a sadistic way of playing this game, but I just found it to be so interesting. Charles Griffiths, as we know, but maybe many people probably don't know the composer, is an American composer who was very much influenced by the Impressionists and wrote very much in this style. And an interesting tidbit as well about Charles Griffiths is that he died of influenza in New York during the 1918 pandemic.
And tell us what the other 2 were, just so that we have a...
Yes. So the first excerpt, of course, was by Debussy, and it's from his Images, Book 1, and it's Reflections in the Water. And then the 3rd one was from his Preludes, Book 1, and the title of that is The Wind in the Plain. So both 2 and 3 dealt with wind and started on the same pitch and very much sounded like Debussy. All right, well, that concludes our Prelude segment of the week, and I'm going to toss it over to
EDMOND DEDE was a 19th century composer, conductor, and violinist whose life as an African-American expatriate making his living as a classical musician in France is one of the more unique stories in classical music history. Born in New Orleans in 1827 to a black family whose legal freedom stretched back 4 generations, Dede's studies and career took him as far afield as Mexico City, Algiers, London, Paris, and Antwerp. The majority of his life was spent in the port city of Bordeaux in the southwest of France, where he served as music director for a number of theaters and composed everything from light popular songs to serious ballets, tone poems, and operas. Here to discuss the remarkable journey of EDMOND DEDE is Sally McKee, author of The Exile's Song, EDMOND DEDE and the Unfinished Revolutions of the Atlantic World, published by Yale University Press in 2016. Dr. McKee is a professor of history at UC Davis, whose work focuses on African and European Americans' engagement with intellectual and cultural movements of the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Sally, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sally, I really enjoyed reading this book, and what I loved about it was that it was so enriched with cultural history surrounding this life, which in some ways has only sketchy documentary evidence. You know, there's not that much to go on, but you gave so much background about where EDMOND DEDE came from, and I thought that we might start there. Could you tell us a little bit about the colony of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans in the early 19th century, and why that was maybe the one place where a career and a life like that of EDMOND DEDE could have originated?
That's a great starting point, because let's start with his birth year of 1827. And so his great-grandparents they were freed actually in 1782, 83, something like that. That was the most recent year that his family had been enslaved. And what makes that interesting is that this is a family that did marry people from outside the city, from Cuba, but they were not strictly speaking Creole in the sense that they were mixed race. EDMOND DEDE came from a family that was solidly of African descent. And that mattered a lot in New Orleans because there was this bit of a dichotomy between the mixed-raced, more lightly complected people of color in the city and the people who were more, strictly speaking, descendants of slaves at one point and who were darker skinned. And within the city, both among white people and Black people and Creoles in the mixed race population, the DEDE family would have been probably looked down upon in a sense by all the other groups because they were so darkly complected. Now, DEDE himself grew up in a city that contained the biggest community of free people of color in the early 19th century. The only other population in the United States at that point that had nearly as large a community was Baltimore. So DEDE grew up in a city where he was surrounded by people who looked like him, but who were, let's say, on the lowest rung of the free people of color. And he was surrounded by people who were also darkly complected. And it was a strictly segregated city, but in 1827, when he was born, the real strict segregation was not quite yet in force. It wouldn't become really a very unfriendly place to people of African descent until the late 1840s and 50s. So as he grew older, his own town became increasingly hostile to his presence and the presence of other people like him. He was further at a disadvantage because he was not legitimate. He was the child of a woman who was not married to his father, but his father did involve himself with the upbringing of EDMOND DEDE and seems to have been instrumental to a certain extent in ensuring that DEDE received the beginnings of a musical education that set him up then to be able to reach out to music teachers in the city, both white and Black, who then prepared him as a music student to the point where they, in effect, backed him in his ambition to go study in Paris.
So before we get too deep into his travels, I wanted to ask you about one detail that was really striking, which was you talked a little bit in the book about the Free Negro Philharmonic in New Orleans. And I think you said something like it was the largest orchestra in town. Can you give any background about that group?
So there, again, we don't know a whole lot about it because there isn't much of its records are no longer exist. But there was an orchestra made up of all sorts of people at a time when, so this would have been in the early 1840s. And the Negro Philharmonic had musicians who were Black, Creole, and white at certain points. The white musicians were probably the smallest number. The existence of the Negro Philharmonic is a testament to how accessible European music was to all demographics in New Orleans at that time. There was a market, in a sense, there was an audience, a demand for European music in New Orleans among the free people of color, and also among some of the slaves, because there are references to, for instance, the opera house, the French opera house, and other smaller musical enterprises in the city where slaves were sneaking in and going up to the top seats. And so they were trying to police that a bit, but at a certain point, I think they just said, oh, whatever.
So it sounds like, Edmond DEDE was in the perfect place as well in terms of becoming inspired to become a musician, because obviously that wasn't something like, as you write, it's not something that was very common for someone to leave the country and go and further their studies in music. So could you talk to us a little bit about how he gets to France and some of his earlier experiences in terms of his studies and how he then became a music director in Bordeaux, of all places?
Sure. Now, it wasn't entirely unusual for people in New Orleans to go to Paris to study. After all, New Orleans is a Francophone city, or was a Francophone city, both Creole white and Creole Black. But let's use Creole to describe the mixed race and Black people in the city. So there were a few people, including one or two Creoles of color, mixed race people, men mainly, who had gone to Paris to study music. DEDE had two teachers, one of whom really is the important one. He was an Italian immigrant who came to New Orleans. He seemingly, apparently wrote a letter of introduction for DEDE. Now, as I explain in the book, that was a problem in some sense. DEDE could not have really had an expectation, unless he was really out of touch, or including his teachers out of touch, with the Conservatory of Music in Paris, because he was too old.
Right. I thought that was interesting, too, is that in this country, the thing that would have kept him from getting into a conservatory was his race. But in France, it was actually just his age. They were happy to have Black people as students at the conservatory. Is that right?
Exactly. They had no problem with that. The difference between France and the United States with regard to people of color is that it was the United States that had the restrictive laws. France didn't really have those restrictive laws, but both places, both the United States and France, were not all that welcoming of Black people. But there was no structural legal framework for expressing that dislike of people of color in France, because French people were ambivalent about slavery, but they didn't actually live with the people that French authorities enslaved. People in the US did. Mm-hmm. And so they set up much more legal divisions to separate the people that they were having to live with. So in France, DEDE actually encounters quite a bit of racism, but he's not kept out of institutions. He's not told to sit separately. There's no formal mechanism for segregation in France. And when he went to France, he knew or found out right away that he wasn't going to be able to matriculate in and enroll in the conservatory because he was too old. So he shaves off a couple of years, off of his age. He manipulates his passport to make it seem that he's younger. And, who's going to know? Because, the technology of public documents at that time made it pretty easy to do that. So he goes to Antwerp just to spend some time and make some money with some people from back home. And then he returns to Paris after a certain amount of time so that he can begin taking lessons from the faculty at the conservatory.
Right, from Alevi, if I remember correctly, right? The composer of La Juive.
And that was pretty impressive. I mean, to be a private student of Alevi must have been, it gives you an idea of what people thought about his playing, because he was taking lessons in violin at that point. And he worked around in Normandy and Rouen, and then he went to Angers, and then he went, maybe a couple of other places before he got a job as the assistant conductor at the Grand Théâtre in Bordeaux, the Grand Theater, where he was in charge of rehearsing the ballet corps. And we know from a pretty early point that when he got there, which is probably around 1860, that he was already he was composing pieces for the ballet. There were ballets that were part of operas, and he would compose the music for those, like one-act little dances in the middle of an opera.
So as a lot of composing happens, it's sort of like on a need-to basis. He found himself in this conducting job, and then he segued into writing music that was for functions in this ballet company.
That's right. And so, but you can tell that he does have aspirations to compose longer and bigger pieces. The National Library of France has a big collection of his sheet music, and there's nothing like symphonies in there, although there are orchestral pieces that are shorter.
Right.
But nothing, the opera, which is kind of the mystery at the heart of the book in some ways, finding that manuscript, that was like the longest piece that I ever saw among all the sheet music that he produced. Everything up to that point were all these short pieces and then songs for the music halls he later worked for.
Just to bring in my co-host here a little bit, I'll admit that I did not hear of EDMOND DEDE until he turned up in a segment that we did a couple months ago. It was about this whole concept of full naming composers. We all thought that was sort of silly, but DEDE was mentioned in there, and I had never heard of him, but we were reading that, and I mentioned it to Tiffany and Kensho here, and they had both had experience. So Tiffany, we're just referring now to this opera that DEDE wrote, which, Sally, if I understand correctly, this is the opera Margiane ou le Sultan du Safa, which is perhaps the earliest surviving opera by a Black person from 1887. And Tiffany, you participated in a performance of the overture of this piece, is that correct?
So I had the fortune to work with Richard Rosenberg, and I was in the premiere performance of the overture that was performed in Floyd, Virginia at the National Music Festivals in its inaugural season in 2011. And so I wanted to ask about that grand mystery because, of course, I was pretty young at the time, so all I remember from that experience was, oh yeah, this is kind of an interesting work whose origins and whose destiny were not really realized, and which we are shrouded in this kind of mystique. So I want to hear more about this piece that I've apparently have premiered.
To me, the importance of the piece is that even though I learned a few years later that there was a previous opera by an African-American in Europe who had composed an opera, but that did not exist. And if it ever existed, but there was apparently some previous thing. But DEDE's opera is unique in that it predates, Tremonisha by at least 25 years. Mm-hmm. And it is, as I explain in the book, as hokey as any other opera, plot that you could think of. But it has many different features in it that are worth reflecting on for a working composer at that time, because Edmond Dede is in the position of having to compose music for a libretto that valorizes, at one point in an aria, white skin, and I just wonder, how did he feel about that? Writing a piece in which the Sultan is talking about the alabaster skin or something like that.
And of course, it's interesting that it's a sultan talking about this too, because then this brings in this whole vague of exoticism, which was so popular in France in the late 19th century, even into the 20th.
That's right. In that sense, I mean, he's clearly responding to what he thinks of as a demand. On the one hand, I mean, let's put this in a little bit in some chronological order. So he couldn't go on really working as an assistant conductor at the Grand Theater, mainly because of money. So he switches to the popular music mode. He begins as musical director of some of the big music halls in Bordeaux, the old Café Concert, the precursors like the English music hall more than our vaudeville. But they were big spectacular shows, and people would come and eat and drink, but mainly drink at these performances. And they were right in the heart of the center of Bordeaux, and they were very popular. And that's the venue that he wrote most of his songs and pieces for. So the existence of the opera shows that he was aware of the dichotomy between serious art music and popular music. And he was more concerned with his own, sense of self, of wanting to be taken seriously as an art music composer. And that was his life goal. And that's why he probably composed Molchian over a decade.
And it was thought for a very long time that the opera hadn't been finished, right? Up until fairly recently.
That's right. But it was,
right.
In fact. And it's long, and it would have been really expensive to produce because it's got crowd scenes, it's got Sultan's Palace as the background and all that. And it's got a ballet, of course. And he did finish it, but he never got it produced.
So I like Tiffany, have had some experience performing DEDE, but actually what's funny is that I performed a piece called En Chasse. And so you're familiar with the story in that, I thought it was Edmond Dede at first, but actually the piece itself was a piano piece written by his son, Eugène Dede. And so you were speaking on, the initial kind of inspiration for Edmond being his father, who was encouraging his musical studies. So can you talk a little bit about how he then also passed that on to his son, or how involved was Eugène in music, and did he end up composing a lot more, or what is the story there?
Well, in 1867, Eugène Arcade was born in Bordeaux. And Edmond Dede had married just a couple of years before a young woman of French ancestry, an illegitimate woman who was a seamstress. Edmond raised his son to work with him. And Eugène, as far as I can tell, never aspired to compose art music. By the time that he was of age to help his father, Edmond Dede had long been working in the music halls. And so that's basically what Eugène was trained for. Eventually, he moved to Paris and began working at a theater in the Gaîté Montparnasse, which was one of the main music halls in Paris, and acquired apparently a quite good reputation as not just a lyricist, but he also, as a songwriter. And he made a living at it. So when Edmond Dede and his wife finally retire, which was around 1890, they moved to Paris to be with their son. And their son was employed throughout his life by the music hall. And he married a woman who was a Hungarian Jew. And her parents were back in Budapest, but they married and had kids. Now, this is the part where you guys wouldn't even be aware of this. Last year, I was in Paris and was at the City Archives, and I found something that I was not prepared for, which was that I thought that Eugene's 2 children had died without children. But while I was in Paris last year, I found out that Eugene had remarried after the death of his first wife. And he had had 2 or 3 children who went on to have kids and lived. So there are direct descendants of Edmond DEDE somewhere in France, but because of the nature of the civil law, I can't access the public documents yet. And so everybody thinks that Edmond DEDE doesn't have any surviving descendants, and it turns out he looks like he does.
Oh my gosh, wow. This is a scoop, exclusive for the Classical Gab Fest. Oh my gosh. If any of our French listeners, I mean, this has been a very Francophile episode. We've done some other segments on this show that are very French leaning, but so if any of our French listeners are potentially descendants of Edmond DEDE, please write in. But Tiffany,
and
I know
Will will give you my address.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll put you in touch. Well, I don't know if the answer to this question is related to, the existence of direct descendants of Edmond DEDE, but how do we perform his music more? I mean, like, is there a publishing, something or other in the works, and why not? Like, the time would seem to be right.
Have you heard of an opera company in New Orleans called Opera Creole?
No.
They specialize in the music of Creoles of color all throughout the 19th and 20th century. They are a small, seriously underfunded outfit. The founder and the director of it are on the faculty at Loyola, which is right next to Tulane. Their big dream is to mount a production, or at least a concert form of Morgian, which
awesome.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're going to be able to do it just because of the funding situation and all the problems and so forth. But I wish them luck, because I wish they would. I mean, that's why I've been so anxious to shine a bit of light on this, because this is a big part of U.S. history. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that DEDE spent like 36, 37 years overseas has, let's say, muddied the waters a little bit, in the sense that people don't think of him as necessarily an American composer. But he thought about the United States, his family, and the struggles going on in the United States his whole life. The fact that he came back in 1893 is indicative of how his mind and his heart was always looking towards home. It's just that there was no place for him at home, even after Reconstruction, collapsed. And in the period, he couldn't come back again for good. So we need more people to pay attention to him.
Absolutely. And for that reason, Sally, we're so glad that you came on the show to talk about Edmond DEDE today. And I just have to say a couple of things before we wrap here. One is that I will confess that when we have authors on the show, what I usually do is download the sample chapter onto my Kindle and read that. And then I've read the introduction, and that's like enough to get by. With your book, I did that, and I could not put down the book. I had to get the book and read it to the very end because, and we haven't talked about this, and I don't want to spoil it, the book starts with an episode that's basically like the Titanic. I mean, it is an adventure story on the high seas, and it is so exciting, and it sort of sets up a mystery that is answered or hypothesized about at the end of the book. So I don't want to say anything more about that, but it's just a really gripping beginning, and it's such a well-written book, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. So I do hope that our listeners will check it out. But before we do let you go here, Sally, the last thing we like to do is to have our guests recommend something for our classical mixtape. Would you be down to do that?
I would.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Sally, what would you like to share with our listeners?
I think it would be a great idea if you want to understand DEDE's trajectory, to start by looking at what he listened to. So I would say start with Revue.
And that was Rachel Camp du Seigneur from Alevi's La Juive. Thank you for that recommendation, Sally. Tiffany, what you got?
I have a new version of an old piece. This is Couperin's Les Barricades Mystérieuses, played on the marimba by the percussionist who is in the finals of Les Victoires de la Musique, Aurélien Genieux. And this is him playing the marimba.
You know, I have played this piece many times, including for a friend's wedding in Hawaii as the bridal entrance music. It was
on marimba?
No, I played it on the electric keyboard. We were outside, and there was an amp, and it was a lot of fun. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Could have next time you play it for a wedding, you can set the keyboard to the marimba.
That is right. Yeah, I could have played it on the marimba.
Okay, William, what do you have for us?
All right, well, this particular piece I have chosen for a number of reasons, and I'm going to try to get through all of them really quickly. Number one of the interesting items from the Los Angeles Philharmonic concert that we watched was the final piece was the finale of Mahler's Fourth Symphony in a chamber orchestra arrangement, which included not only piano, but also the harmonium, which is like a little foot pump organ. And it crops up here and there in the world of classical music, but there is one piece that is written for both piano and harmonium and choir, or a small selection of voices. And this is the Kyrie from the Petite Messe Solennelle by Gioacchino Rossini. Now, I chose this particular recording, which is by the Netherlands Chamber Choir. I'll even give that a shot. The Nederlands Kamerkoor, as conducted by Manoj Kamps, who is a Sri Lankan Dutch conductor. What I like about this recording in particular is that it is the one recording where you can really hear the harmonium. Now, I've known this piece for a while. It's one of my favorites because it is featured on the soundtrack of one of my favorite movies, La Mala Educación of Pedro Almodóvar.
Very cool. And in celebration of our wonderful chat with Sally McKee on Edmond DEDE, I was struck by something that Sally said that, despite him having spent over 3 decades overseas that his mind was always back at home in the United States. So I picked a piece entitled Chicago Grande Valse à l'Américaine, and this is performed by the Hot Springs Music Festival Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Richard Rosenberg, who we also mentioned in the interview earlier.
It's like Johann Strauss almost. This is delightful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very Straussian.
You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening, and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week. I'm seriously so mad at myself. I really was going to say Nielsen for the first time.
You would have been 3 for 3.
I really, really was.